This is the graphic translation final variations lecture and tutorial for the ART161 graphic design class. So in this lecture and tutorial, we're going to look over some specific tools that we can use within this project to push your concepts a little bit further. So going back to the main essence of this project, we are thinking about the process of abstraction, simplification, and stylization of these real world objects. And the outcome of this should be a much more simple and easily recognizable symbol or mark that represents accurately the original real world object. So one of the things that we discussed within this project is ways of creating shade and shadow. And each individual surface of the object needs to be drawn with a closed path, meaning a full shape, so that we can think about individually using fills or strokes later on within these shapes if you are going to use this shade and shadow process. Once the object is drawn with closed paths, then the individual portions of the object can be copied and filled with white and pasted on top of the original drawing. This process enables the designer to create the illusion of a light source as well as create the light source. So we looked at this previously, and what we see here is a graphic that has been designed on one side, either the left or the right, and then use the reflection tool to get that exact same elements on the opposite side so that it is completely symmetrical. Once you have that as closed off shapes, then you can come back in and copy and paste some of those shapes on top, convert those to white, and use those as areas to show a highlight or a low light on the form. Now remember, we're only using black and white within this process. So what we're going to do is take a look at how we can use a couple of these tools. And the first one we want to look at is the reflection tool. So if I have this sketch behind here and I have half of the face of the owl drawn, I want the exact same thing on the other side. Instead of trying to retrace that as accurately as possible, I'm going to simply group all of these elements together. So if we go back here and ungroup these, we can use the black arrow tool or the selection tool and hold shift to select all of the different items, holding shift to select everything on the left-hand side in this case. We'll go ahead and group those together. And then you'll notice that within this little pop-up box here, there's this repeat object. If you click on that repeat object, you can actually come down here to mirror, and it will automatically mirror all of those elements over so that you have a complete graphic that is completely symmetrical on both sides. I can simply click out of that, and now I have this complete graphic. Now, to add in some of that light and shadow, this is where you would, and I'm going to move over to a different reference here. This is where you can think about going about this a couple different ways. Now, if you have the silhouette method and the extraction method, where you have a full silhouette of the object, as you can see here, and different elements on top of that object that are in white to blend in with the paper, you can quickly make some alterations to your highlights and your lowlights. So for example, if we want the light source to kind of come from sort of the left or above here, we might think about putting some highlights across the top of the form, creating closure and that positive and negative space. If we wanted the light source to come from the bottom, we could think about where these elements would be placed along the bottom of this and include that closure along the bottom of the form here as well. And these are all just different shapes on top of this black shape that blend in with the white of the paper. And I've actually gone in and created another stroke here as well, just to help the eye kind of continue that form along the bottom. So you can see how we're tying some of these elements together here within the space. One thing that can be very helpful is the shape builder tool. And this allows you to group different shapes together and also subtract from those shapes as well. So if we think about how we could apply that here, we may want to group multiple items together. I'll just do a simple practice here by creating a couple of ellipses. And basically, if I wanted to make these into one shape, I could use the Shift key to select both of these objects, come over to the Shape Builder tool, which is on the left-hand side in your tool palette. And if I click on that, I can simply click into any of these areas that it's highlighting here within these forms. Clicking through will automatically group these together to create one shape. And that is the default of this tool. You'll see the little plus sign. Now, if I wanted to subtract parts of this design, maybe where they overlap or on any of these fields here, I can simply hold my Alt or my Option key on my keyboard, and that will convert from a plus sign to a negative sign. That allows me to go in and start to remove parts of this design here so that I can start to kind of have more of a complete shape that is not made of multiple shapes. So why would that be beneficial here? Well, right now, if this is on the wide of the page, we can't really tell that these are additional shapes. But if we were to hand this off to a client and they wanted to use this on some sort of colored background, like we can see over here, if we drag this out of the artboard, we can see that it's very obvious that these are additional shapes here within the space. So anytime you are finalizing a mark and you're preparing to hand this off to a client, you need to go through and make sure that it is a complete mark and only using one color. So in this case here, we'll select all of these elements of the bird. I'm just going to use the black arrow tool and click and drag to select everything. Coming back to my shape builder tool, this is where I can come back in and either group shapes together as the default or subtract shapes by holding the Alt or Option key. And basically, I'm just going to go through and start to subtract areas where the white is so that eventually you will just have one color that can be used to create your final mark. Now, this would be the type of file, whoops, little area there we'd have to get rid of. This would be the type of file we'd want to hand off to a client, right? Because this is a one color file that they could use on any sort of colored background, and it will not be using two different colors. Another thing that we can think about is visual punctuation. And the technique of line and dots are very effective in guiding the viewer's eye. So the eye tends to move along a line and then stops and rests on any sort of dots. It's almost like a period to a sentence. And this can be seen on the top and left middle surface of the motor in the example here on the left, as well as the shell. They're using these lines to lead the viewer's eyes and then using these punctuation dots here to kind of act as points of emphasis within the space. So again, you could think about how you could play with that line variation within the space as well, whether you wanted to have some particular elements that use dots within the lines. You could either use the ellipse tool to create those dots where you wanted those visual punctuations to be. So let's say I wanted some sort of dot to be here within the space. I convert this to black. Maybe I'd want to use these as visual punctuations within the space to kind of lead the viewer's eyes around the object and just give it some line variation there. Another thing that you can do is think about using your strokes as dotted lines as well. And this is going to be two tools we're going to look at. We're going to look at converting strokes into dotted lines and grouping that with the width tool as well. So the first thing we want to do is if we wanted to convert some sort of stroke to a dotted line, change this back to a uniform stroke here, both of these cases. Then what we want to do is we want to select both of these strokes up at the top of the wings here. And I'm going to come over to my stroke window here. Now remember, I am in my workspace of the tracing. So this should look similar to what you have on screen. I'm going to set this to, let's go to 2 point for that. Now, what you'll notice is when I open up my stroke window, I have a few different options here, but if I click on the top right, I can actually go to show options and give myself a few additional options within the space. In order to make a dotted line, I want to do a couple things. I'm going to convert this to, again, 1 point. I'm going to use a rounded cap. That's important. And then I'm going to click on this dashed line down here. Now, dashed lines will do just that, a dashed line within the space. But if I want this to be a dotted line, I need to set this up at a 0.25 dash and any gap that I want within the space. So coming back over here, if I go to 0.25 within the dash and then set up my gap to say, start with 4 here, you'll notice that it automatically takes my stroke and converts it into these points. And I can still select on these and change the width of my line here, and it will increase the points. If those get too close together, I can always spread out the gap a little bit further by increasing the number in the gap. But the dash should stay at 0.25 with a rounded cap in order to get those dotted lines. Now, another tool that we mentioned was the width tool. And what the width tool does is it allows you to take strokes, like we can see here, and manipulate the width of those strokes within different parts of the form. So if I have a standard stroke here within the space, I'm going to come over to my toolbar on the left and click into my width tool. And with that stroke selected, I can start to pick parts of the stroke that I want to either make thicker or thinner within the space. And I'm simply clicking onto the line and either pulling it in or pulling it out to create that variation within the width of your line. This is a very, very effective tool for this project because it allows you to have what is otherwise a very sort of uniform line into a much more stylized sort of width here. And you can see how by going into this, I've created just with one single stroke, a much more stylized sort of line here. Now, the same thing can be used on the forms. If we look at the fish here in the exterior of the form of the fish, we have some areas that are thicker and thinner within that line. So within the stroke that we have here, same thing. I would just go in and start to decide where I want this to be thicker and where I want this to be thinner within this space to start to call out this form. And it takes what, again, is a regular uniform shape into a much more stylized sort of complex line here. So again, that is using the dotted line by using the dash tool at 0.25 for the dash, as well as the width tool. Now, you can use these two together as well. If we go back to the line variation that we did, we played with this stroke here, and you'll notice that this is still uniform. But if I go ahead and go back to my width tool, even though this is a dotted line that we've already made, we can actually use that width tool within the dotted lines here as well. And that can give the variation of different points and the sizing of those points within the space, right? So you can think about how you can combine these different tools together. Now, one important thing to consider within your organic objects, if you've chosen something that has eyes, like an animal, is this is always going to be a point of visual interest and focus for a graphic translation of any creature. The stylization of the eye is an important step in creating a compelling translation. And the goal in drawing the eye is not to create reality, but to simplify that and think about portraying the eye convincingly. Because eyes are a point of focus, they should be slightly enlarged to enhance that visual interest. And this is a good time to go back to that original image that you have. Think about what the actual form is. You're almost thinking about this entire practice of graphic translation and simplification just applied to this single eye element. Now, oftentimes there's going to be different eyes depending on the creature that you're working on, but most of the time there's going to be some sort of highlight that's used within the eye to kind of show that sort of form within the space. And a lot of times that highlight is going to be kind of tucked in underneath that upper eyelid. We can see a variation of different eye styles over here. And over here on the right, we can see how they're applying that towards the actual form. It's slightly larger And it really becomes a point of emphasis within this illustration over here, showing these highlights and these lowlights within the form of that circular shape, giving it much more of this sort of three-dimensional look and feel. So again, going back to your original image, don't be afraid to kind of reference that. Think about the angle of the eye, as we can see here. Think about simplifying that. What do you really need to call out here? You need this center pupil and some sort of highlight within the space to call that. And then we need some basic form on the exterior of that to show the housing of the eye. Another tool that we're going to borrow from our visual principles assignment is repetition. A lot of objects, both from the natural and the man-made environment, have areas of repetition that can become points of visual engagement in a drawing. Often it's possible to stylize and simplify these textures in order to create this visual interest. So we can see here on the left, we have this repetition that's happening on the back of the shell for the lobster. The same sort of line quality up here at the top, these dotted lines, and it seems like it's receding into space. Same thing over here on the right. They're taking the very complicated scales of an alligator, and they're using these dotted lines to represent those as they recede into space and get smaller and smaller. So in order to use, actually, I'm gonna go back here really quick. In order to use that, we want to think about how we can combine the blend tool with some of these other tools as well, such as the dotted lines or the width tool. Now, the blend tool is going to be found on the toolbar on the left-hand side. And essentially, it allows you to blend any objects together, whether they are different shapes, different colors, and you can specify how you want to blend these, whether it's a smooth color or specified steps where you're calling out how many times those are being repeated. So if we come into the blend tool here, let me copy both of these. Whoops. We'll just recreate that. How about this? So let's see if I wanted to create this sort of shape here that's along the bottom of the neck, something like that. And maybe have another one down below. Adjust these a little bit. I'm going to play with this a little bit so we can see the difference. I'm going to increase the stroke size here, and I'm going to play with the width tool a little bit on this bottom line so that we can kind of see what we're doing to make a difference here within this shape. So I'm just playing with the width tool along this bottom line here, creating some variation within that width. Slide that over a little bit. Not perfect, but it'll work for what we're trying to accomplish here. So if I have this line here at the bottom and I have a line up at the top, increase the size of that slightly. Basically, I can blend these shapes together. And if I hold the shift key to select both of those objects, I can come over here to the left and go to my blend tool. Now, by double clicking on the blend tool, this brings up your blend options, whether you want to use smooth color, specified steps, or specified distance. I'm going to go with specified steps here, and I'm going to use, let's use 8. That's fine. Actually, you know what? Let's use 6, be less. And I'll hit OK. Now, since I have these two objects selected, and I have 6 specified steps, all I need to do is use my blend tool, select on the first object, select on the second object, and it should automatically blend these together. Now, if that's too many, you can always double click back into that blend tool and change the specified steps. Maybe you want 4, maybe you want 3. And you'll notice what's happening is it's blending this stroke into the stroke down here that has varying width. And you can see that slowly kind of transforming into the space. And any changes that we make within this, if I were to change the direction of this potentially, you'll see that it's automatically blending those together as well. We can even combine those with things like the dotted line if you wanted to. And notice that the dotted line is transitioning into this solid line down here. If we wanted to have both of these be dotted lines, maybe getting rid of the varying width within the space, we can see how we're kind of duplicating the look and feel that we saw in the lecture there on the back of the alligator's back. We have a stroke up here that is set to 2 point and a stroke down here that is set to 8 point. And of course, I could always increase the gap down here if I needed to kind of open that up a little bit on that bottom line. This is a really, really helpful tool to be able to create that repetition within the space and show that sort of form and texture based on what it is that you are working on. So again, this stroke right here and the stroke all the way in the back over here could be blended together to create that sort of pattern along the back. Same thing over here along the back of the lobster. Now, one thing we've talked a lot about is closure, and I want everybody to be using closure within their graphic translation, meaning using positive and negative space and having elements bleed into the background. This makes the object more interesting, and it uses the background white space to become part of the drawing. So again, whether you are using additional shapes on top of a black silhouette, like we can see in both of these examples at the top, or you are simply using strokes to imply those lines and create that closure. In both of these cases, there are elements that are not closed off shapes. The white of the page is bleeding into these forms, but our eyes are still able to continue these lines based on the positioning of those. And this works hand in hand with the light source. So thinking about where that light source is, once you've determined that, if we say that we want that to be on the top right-hand side or the right-hand side, that's going to determine where your highlights and your lowlights are going to go, and that will give you a good clue as far as where you can create that closure within the space. And we talked about this already, converting lines to points. Points, lines, and planes are the basic visual elements of design, and as the translation progresses, it becomes possible to convert lines into a series of points. The dotted line can become a regular portion of the pattern, or possibly a rhythmical pattern moving from smaller dots to larger ones. The rhythm of the dots guide the eye and contrast solid lines that fill the additional areas. So think about how you might take some of your strokes and convert those into the dotted lines, again, using the 0.25 dash within your dotted line of your stroke. Sometimes this can also be really, really effective to show additional lines outside of the space, potentially showing some sort of movement or highlighting the form in some way. And again, in order to do this, you want to make sure that you are going into your stroke, that you are using a rounded cap, and the dashed line should be set to 0.25 within the dash, and as large as you want that gap to be within the space. Now, as a final step here, you could think about communicating some sort of movement or function through your drawing. So a lot of times when we get into this, the actual translation can feel a little bit still, like there's not really any action happening. And when we think about communicating some sort of movement, we can use repetition and use these dotted lines to create that illusion of movement. A dotted line is special because it's ambiguous in space. It uses the background as a sort of area to call out the form. So taking the example here on the left, converting some of the lines in here to the dotted lines, and then bringing additional lines into this space, both solid and dotted lines, creates this sense of movement here for the bird. Same thing down here for the frog. We can see that this feels pretty static within the space, but as soon as we start to add these sort of dotted lines around the body, almost like it's shaking or moving, and in this case, adding an additional tongue, acting like it's catching this sort of bug, sort of activates the image here. So combining those dotted lines, the width tool to the strokes, oftentimes this can be a great way to show and communicate movement, or function within an object, such as a blender, perchance, or some sort of speaker, or some sort of animal or organic object. Within these final stages here, the final variations, this gives you an opportunity to combine these ideas, to try new strategies, and explore what is the most effective solution for your final mark. There should be some obvious differences in new renderings created to exhaust different ways to represent your subject as you move through into your final graphic translation. So please work through this module, and if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out.